Good afternoon, everyone. And I know there's a big crowd here. I can't see you, but I'm really pleased to have so many hundreds of law school alumni, Wharton alumni, other affiliates of the university. And I'm here. I'm Dean Ted Ruger of the law school. I'm here in the law school building where we are actually one of the few parts of Penn. We are doing some limited in-person instruction. Most of the 1Ls have some in-person classes, as well as some upper class students, all appropriately socially distanced, as well as doing a lot of remote teaching and remote engagement. And so today's lecture from a distinguished alum, Michael Smerconish, is another thing that we've been doing a lot of in this COVID era, is reaching out and connecting alumni and having really exciting speakers who may even reach a broader scope thanks to this virtual world we're in. And I know that many of you are joining us from all over the country and in some cases even from other countries. So it's a great, really pleasure and privilege to have Michael Smerconish, one of the leading experts of our politics, of our election system generally, and certainly with this interesting, bizarre, complex election of 2020. And there's a lot to say about it. So we're going to get right to Mr. Smerconish. I will say quickly, by way of introduction, we're very proud. Michael is a class of 1987 graduate of this law school. And I know that there's a healthy contingent of law class of 1987 with us, so welcome to hear your classmate. Before that, he was Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Lehigh University and grew up in the area. He hosts a daily radio program heard nationwide on SiriusXM's POTUS channel, and is also the host of CNN's Smerconish on Saturdays at 9 a.m. as well as some other times. He's been a print journalist with the Philadelphia Daily News and the Sunday Philadelphia Inquirer. He's the author of 7 books. I think some of them are on the screen here. I have a feeling this election may produce another book, Michael. You could talk about that. And as well as has written a novel, which has the television rights have been optioned to Warner Brothers, called Talk. His latest book is called Clowns to the Left of Me, Jokers to the Right, American Life in Columns. And so and I've heard you speak before, and I'm really excited, and thank you for being here, Michael. We will, and you're so generous to spend your time in what I can only imagine how busy it is, and likewise to take a few minutes of questions for the end. We do have a healthy list of email questions that any of the participants have emailed. I'll try to kind of condense some of those for you at the end. I also would note, and with appreciation for my staff colleagues in setting this up, this is available for CLE credit, so there'll be a few passwords through the show, and I think, Michael, you're going to give the first one, but thank you so much. We're so glad to have you back virtually at your alma mater and have you make some sense of this crazy political scene for us. So thank you, Michael.
Dean Ruger, thank you so much, and good afternoon to the Penn community. I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss what is clearly the most unpredictable election of our lives. The president says it's the most momentous. I'm not sure about that, but unpredictable. I have a high degree of confidence that that's accurate. First, the bad news. If you wanted to hear from a proven political prognosticator, then you probably should have brought in a soothsayer, because instead you got me, one of the many who is paid to pay close attention to politics but did not see the Trump train coming in 2016. And in my case, I was witness over many years to the very circumstances that enabled Donald Trump's rise. Just this past May, I celebrated my 30th year in talk radio. And that's the same time period in which I've been paying close attention to our political process. Since 1980, actually, when I turned 18 and first registered to vote. I've never missed an election for which I've been eligible to vote since then. And I've further experienced our political process as a media observer, as a political operative. I was a presidential appointee in the administration of George Herbert Walker Bush. I was even a candidate for the Pennsylvania state legislature when I was 23 years old and a 2L at Penn Law. I remember fondly that with the support of Vice Dean Margot Post-Marshak, everything was set. If I won, I could complete my law work at Dickinson and still be awarded a Penn Law degree. Instead, I lost by 419 votes. And as I like to say, I have since located 236 of those people. My involvement happens to mirror a period of profound political transformation in America, an era of change that enabled the election of Donald Trump. And that's why I feel I should have seen it coming, a point not lost on the president himself. I can't believe Smerconish. I can't believe that CNN would waste time and money on Michael Smerconish. He's got nothing going. Jeff Zucker must be losing his touch. Jeff Zucker is the president of CNN Worldwide. Thank you, Mr. President. It's also a subject about which he was eager to remind me when we later met in the Oval Office. I believe that we can't properly analyze what will happen a week from tomorrow unless we first understand how Donald Trump scored the greatest political upset in modern history. And I argue that his improbable victory was 3 decades in the making, but that it had nothing to do with how he spent those years. Instead, the table was set for him. See, for 7 presidential cycles, he flirted with a run for the presidency, all the while building his real estate and media empire. He gained notoriety after building projects like Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue, and then dipped his toe in the national political waters with a trip that he made to New Hampshire. This particular event was October 22nd, 1987, at Yokin's Restaurant in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. There she blows. And by all accounts, Donald Trump wowed a standing room only crowd, and immediately came the speculation that he would soon run. But that didn't happen. And contrary to what he said at the time, I don't think that he would have won if he had tried in 1988. Nor do I think he would have won in 1992 or 1996 or the year 2000, 2004, 2008, 2012, because in each one of those cycles, he told us that he was contemplating running. But by 2016, the timing now was right. The political landscape had shifted largely because of the rise of a partisan media. And that began with Rush Limbaugh's syndication in 1988. At the time, there was no place for conservatives to get their news and their entertainment, and Rush filled that void. After Limbaugh and a stable of his imitators gained a hold on AM talk radio, public opinion was no longer being shaped just by NBC, ABC, CBS, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. And that reliance on mainstream media was then further lessened by the founding of Fox News, by MSNBC, and of course by the advent of the internet. And I argue that these media platforms, the megaphones, the mouse clicks, they enabled people with personality to wrest the microphone away from traditional party leadership. In other words, no longer did a political upstart need to bide their time. We don't say it this way in this country, but I like the British reference to being a backbencher. We have that same system, or at least we had it, where you'd pay your dues and you would acquire seniority. And that's the way over a period of years that you'd get ahead in Washington. But now all that was necessary was for a meteoric rise, someone to give good sound bites and then have corresponding fundraising skills. And for sure, it's been an entertaining ride. But the tone, the lack of civility, everything has grown coarsened. And the partisan divide grew as parties were now led by the extremes and not by the middle. And I maintained that Donald Trump would be the ultimate beneficiary of that change in our political landscape. In the 1980s, when Donald Trump first went to that Portsmouth Rotary Club and said that he was thinking of running for president, on Ronald Reagan's watch, there were still many moderates in Washington, D.C. But by the time that he finally ran, they were all gone. And that's not just me offering an anecdotal perspective. I've got the data to back it up. According to the National Journal, on Ronald Reagan's watch, in the 1980s, 60% of the House and 60% of the Senate was comprised of moderates. There were so many moderates in the Republican Senate caucus that they had their own gathering. They called it the Wednesday Lunch Club. And members included some real titans of the U.S. Senate at that time: Bob Dole, Alan Simpson, Nancy Kassebaum, Bob Packwood, John Hines, Arlen Specter, all moderates who were a member of the Wednesday Lunch Club. Today, all gone. And I don't mean through attrition all gone. I mean, they're gone and no one has filled their shoes. There's nothing left of the moderate wing of the Republican Party. And so too, I could make the same observation and assessment of moderate Democrats. Here's an important milestone that I think illustrates my point. The Congress that was elected in 2010 was the first in history with no ideological overlap. In other words, the least conservative Republican in the House or the Senate was still more conservative than the most conservative Democrat in either chamber. And you could say the same thing if you spun that equation on its head and talked about progressives. In other words, the middle had completely disappeared. And that's not a coincidence. That's not correlation. I argue that it's causation. I think that it's a reflection of the influence of a polarized media that I've described. And since 2010, since we reached that milestone, the trend has only continued. So that by 2016, Republican primary voters, the most devoted talk radio listeners, Fox radio viewers, and those who show up in Republican primaries, they were preconditioned. They were primed. They were ready to nominate a candidate who mirrored their favorite media personalities: entertaining, politically incorrect, a champion of outsiders. And Donald Trump seized that mantle. He harnessed the power that was built by a polarized media and then capitalized upon the distrust that had grown in the dominant media. As Harvard professor Thomas Patterson has written, he was a roadshow version of a right-wing talk radio host. And no wonder then that when he first descended on that escalator at Trump Tower and told us that he was running, he rattled off, 4 of the go-to themes from the talk radio playbook: immigration, Islamic terror, free trade, and of course, Obamacare. Now, given my perch on radio and on television, I wish I had seen it coming, but I didn't. Instead, in 2016, I was blinded by the wall. And I'm not talking about the one that the president maintains he's building on our southern border. No, I'm talking about the big blue wall. Do you remember this? It was the idea that no Republican could ever get to 270 electoral votes because of this configuration of Democratic voting states. These 18 states and the District of Columbia that had voted for every Democratic nominee between 1992 and 2012. And together, as you can see, they total 242 electoral votes, not far from the 270 needed. But Donald Trump shattered that wall in 2016. On Election Day, it was a sea of red. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, they all broke ranks. They voted Republican. The margin in each was less than 1%. And yes, he lost the popular vote by 2.8 million votes. But contrary to conventional wisdom, the pollsters didn't do too badly. The Real Clear Politics running national average at the end had Hillary up 3.2 points. She won the popular vote. Her margin was 2.1, not bad. But it was a very thin margin in former blue wall states that carried Donald Trump to electoral college victory. Effectively, 77,759 votes, 77,759 votes cast in 3 states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, determined the outcome of the presidency. And that's out of 137 million cast. Now, obviously, there was a disconnect between the national polling data and what went on in those select states. But what it means is that the Democratic candidate for president has now won the popular vote in 6 of the last 7 elections. And for the second time, a candidate with the most popular votes lost. If Joe Biden wins the election a week from tomorrow, it will be, if he wins the popular vote, it'll be the 7th time of the last 8 elections that the GOP has lost that metric. I find this interesting. The very latest national polling has Joe Biden winning. National polling, yes, we don't elect that way, but work with me for a moment, by 8 or 9 points. Nate Silver from the 538 blog has estimated that Biden needs to win the popular vote by 3 to 4 points to give himself a 74% chance to win the Electoral College. In other words, take a look at that graphic. If Joe Biden wins somewhere between a fraction and 1 percentage point, the popular vote, the likelihood, according to Silver, that he wins the Electoral College is only 6%. A 1 to 2 point national vote victory by Biden, only a 22% likelihood that he also wins the Electoral College. 2 to 3 point victory for Joe Biden, his odds are still below 50%. Said differently, if Donald Trump can pick up 4 to 5 points from where he is today, it suggests he wins the Electoral College. Sam Wong of the Princeton Election Consortium has told me on both radio and television that he believes Donald Trump could lose the popular vote by 5 million. Remember, Hillary lost by roughly 3. He thinks that Trump could lose by 5 million votes and still win the Electoral College. Pretty amazing. Donald Trump won in 2016 by benefiting from a confluence of factors. First, his attacks on the mainstream media and on Hillary Clinton's credibility were each made easier by years of assault of talk radio on each. So much so that by election day, 61% said that Secretary Clinton wasn't honest and trustworthy. He also was able to benefit from Secretary Clinton not replicating the non-white turnout that President Obama had generated in his 2 victories. In other words, she couldn't hold the Obama coalition together. Third, Trump was able to drive a higher proportion of white voters, partly as a function of Secretary Clinton's lack of appeal to minority voters as compared to Barack Obama. Donald Trump also benefited from an unenthused Democratic base, where 61% of eligible voters turned out in 2008. Only 58% turned out in 2012, and worse, 55% turned out in 2016. Hispanics, unmarried women, Asians, millennials, African Americans, all down. And he led a rural rebellion of high school educated white voters, many of whom broke Democratic ranks. By the way, CLE password, GOAT, GOAT. That's funny, isn't it? Okay, there you go, GOAT. Now, we all know why it's GOAT. Come on. In 2016, Donald Trump won 2/3 of white voters without a college degree. High school educated white voters, 2/3 of them he captured. While Secretary Clinton won decisively more than 70% of voters with advanced degrees. In other words, when you look back at what happened in 2016, education, not the usual metric of income, education best predicted support for Trump. Among people of similar income, if you control for income, those with more education were likely to vote for Clinton. Those with less education voted for Trump. Welcome to the education divide. Let me explain what you're looking at. In almost every case, those states where residents had more advanced degrees than the national average, they were won by Hillary Clinton. And those below the national average were won by Trump. The question is, can he do it again? Or can Joe Biden bring home former Democrats who voted for Trump? Donald Trump's big problem in 2020 is that he is wagering on a diminishing demographic. Consider this comparison. In 1988, Papa Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, won 60% of the white vote and won 426 electoral college votes. 60% of the white vote, 426 in the electoral college. 2004, his son, W, wins 58% of the white vote, nearly the same number as his father. But where his father won 426 electoral votes, W won only 286. 426 to 286 for the same relative portion of the white vote. And I recognize there are other factors at play, not the least of which is turnout, but nevertheless, it's a pretty decent apples to apples example of showing how changing demographics have dramatically lessened the impact of the white vote, and that trend will only continue. It's a situation that will get worse for the Republicans in future presidential elections unless the party expands its tent. And make no mistake about what I'm saying, the Republican Party can still succeed and control the U.S. Senate. The Republican Party can still succeed and win gubernatorial mansions. The Republican Party can still win more state legislatures than Democrats. And by the way, at the present time, that's the case in each of those examples: the Senate, gubernatorial mansions, and state legislatures. But Republicans, without expanding the tent, will have difficulty in controlling the White House. On radio, I like to compare it to the squeezing of a lemon, a grapefruit, or an orange. You know, there's only so much pulp to be drawn. And in this cycle, Donald Trump is going to need every last drop. Demographics. Demographics are on the side of the Democratic Party, both today and into the future. I have to say, though, that geography is on the side of the Republican Party. Except in the South, GOP voters are spread more evenly than Democrats, who are concentrated more in the nation's cities and in a handful of states like New York or California. And in a presidential race, what that means is that Democrats waste more votes. Here's an example. The GOP congressional vote, which I'm showing you in 2016, was distributed across country, whereas the Democratic vote was concentrated in cities and on the coasts. What it means is that Democrats can win 50% of congressional votes nationwide, but still hold fewer than 50% of House seats. And so the impact of this geographical advantage should be obvious in a presidential election. The Electoral College allocates according to a state's total of its House and Senate representatives. So, Senate seats, 2 per state, in combination with the heavy concentration of Democratic votes in urban areas and the diffuse nature of the GOP vote nationwide, it produces a disproportionate or rural edge for the Republicans in the Electoral College. Here's another way of thinking about geography. The 2016 election was relatively close, a 2.1% difference in the national popular vote, relatively close, but probably a landslide wherever it is that you live. Whatever the cause, it is clear that we are increasingly living among the like-minded. There are roughly 3,000 counties in the United States. In 2016, actually, there are literally 3,113. In 2016, just 303 were decided by single-digit margins, less than 10%. Less than 10% were decided by single-digit margins. More than 90% were decided by margins of more than 10 points. Very few competitive counties. But you go back to 1992. 1992 was Bush v. Clinton. There were 1,096 counties in that description of being decided by fewer than 10 points. In other words, fewer competitive counties. The number of counties decided by blowouts is growing. Let me illustrate this. Look at this progression of color, which shows counties where the presidential candidate won by more than 20 points. So you take a look at 1992 and just work your way forward. There has been a steady progression of color. Again, where you see color means landslide county. Very little of the country, landslide counties in 1992, and yet almost all by 2016. That's not gerrymandering. That's self-sorting, right? We don't redraw county boundary lines every 10 years. We do that for congressional boundaries. So purple has disappeared. And the question is, why? Chances are your neighbors now share your views. How come? Maybe those who are mobile are making a deliberate decision to include political landscape along with things like good schools and low taxes. Now you want to know, is the school system sound? Are my taxes reasonable? And oh, by the way, am I going to be surrounded by R's or D's? Maybe people are being drawn to areas that earn reputations, swinging from one to another. Think of this community is getting a lot of attention this cycle. Think of the Villages in Florida, in Sumter County, Florida, getting a lot of attention as being this older conservative bastion. Maybe that attracts people. Maybe people are attracted to Austin, Texas, with a reputation for being a pretty funky blue area in a nevertheless red state. Another explanation, maybe the local news media really influences local views. Or perhaps whether it's something we would call osmosis or a metastasis, when you're embedded in an area, you just begin to adopt the views that are prevalent in that area. Here's another geographical curiosity. Regardless of where people live, their retail preferences provide a pretty interesting insight into their voting. And this is my favorite way to analyze the outcome. It's the work of David Wasserman at the Cook Political Report. Cracker Barrel versus Whole Foods. Cracker Barrel versus Whole Foods. Think about it. Are you a Cracker Barrel person? Are you a Whole Foods person? Are you both? Our family, we're both. They build in different areas largely, and they cater to different clients. I'm convinced that they look at political demographics, the sort of information I'm sharing with you, when they decide where to build. Okay, in the 2016 election, as of that time, there were 412 Whole Foods and 642 Cracker Barrels. They overlapped in about 90 counties. Donald Trump won 76% of counties with a Cracker Barrel, just 22% of counties with a Whole Foods. That is a 54% gap, the widest ever recorded. In other words, look at the data in front of you. In 1992, when Bill Clinton was elected, 1992, the disparity between Cracker Barrel counties and Whole Food counties was only 19%. And then there's a steady progression, 19, 23, 31, 39, getting to 54% in 2016. By the way, I've always been curious, and I asked David Wasserman, what do you do about an area like Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, where in Plymouth meeting, we happen to have one of each? And he said he counts them in those very few overlap counties. He puts them in each category. Again, what it means is that today's polarization is not just a function of gerrymandering, a subject that gets great discussion, but also the result of self-sorting. There's a lot of self-sorting going on these days. If a week from tomorrow, what I like to regard as, I don't like to call it election day, because so many people, more than 60 million, have already voted, what I regard it as the final day of voting. If a week from tomorrow is close, then the election is going to be fought on a very small map, which is relatively new. Not long ago, you'd have a dozen states in play. 2020 could be the smallest electoral map that we've had in our history, if it's tight. And all eyes are going to be on Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Florida. Donald Trump has done, I would argue, nothing to expand his base while in office. Perhaps out of fear, I don't know. I'm just trying to analyze that he would alienate the very people he'd attracted if somehow he tried to build bridges, but that has not been his style. So it's a pretty static equation. If he wins Florida again, Joe Biden would need the remaining three, assuming everything else stays the same. Let me say it more clearly. If Donald Trump wins Florida again, Joe Biden would need the remaining three of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, assuming the rest of the map stays the same. And no doubt, by the way, the importance of Florida is why Michael Bloomberg is spending $100 million on Florida. Not nationwide, he's all in Florida, because it's perceived as Trump's Achilles heel, and if Biden can win Florida, it's game over. If the Democrats win Florida, if Joe Biden wins Florida, then any one of the three in the upper Midwest, that includes Pennsylvania, would give them the White House. And the remainder of the states will probably be blowouts, which represents quite a change. Let me compare 1988 and 2016 results. This I think you'll find interesting. This is the 88 result. 1988, unlike 2016, it was a blowout. That is Bush-Dukakis. Bush, 426 electoral votes, And yet in 2016, a closer election, there were more states decided by margins of 15 points or more than there were in 88. Said differently, the blowout election had fewer states decided by blowout numbers. Now, of course, the most recent polling in this election, 2020 election, shows Donald Trump struggling to hold states that he won convincingly in 2016. That he, forget for a moment what he says, forget what the campaign says, forget what they tell you their polling shows, that he had to travel to Georgia and Iowa recently is a sign that no matter what he tells us, the prospect of a landslide is real. Because if he's playing defense in Georgia, he's got a problem. We don't need to think about Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan if the president doesn't win Georgia or Iowa or Ohio or Texas. If any of those states come in and are called on Tuesday night, you will know that he's in for a very rough ride. My 2016 takeaway more than anything else, as we look toward the conclusion of this election, is that I don't think he'd have won had he run for president 30 years ago or any of the intervening cycles until you get to 2016. He became the nation's 45th president while harnessing a media climate that developed all the while he was building his fortune and picking the right moment to finally run. But to do it again, to be successful, he's got to go back to the well one more time on a diminishing demographic. He needs the outsized influence of high school educated white voters, particularly men. And he's going to need to do this in the midst of a pandemic where more will vote by mail than ever before. We've already reached the number of those who voted in advance of the 2016 cycle, and we're still 8 days away. And no doubt that's why he's sowing the seeds of distrust in voting for mail. If it's close, heavy mail voting might also mean that we don't know who wins on the night of November 3rd itself, the final day of voting, but not because of any suggestion or indication of fraud. Be prepared for the red mirage versus the blue shift, largely because of the way in which we conduct elections in this country. It's quite a challenge. David Litt was an Obama speechwriter, and in his book, Democracy in One Book or Less, he gives a paragraph or two summation of the challenges that Election Day in America presents. He writes this: imagine hearing the following pitch on Shark Tank. A nationwide mega chain with no corporate headquarters and no CEO, it will operate 8 times as many U.S. locations as McDonald's, serving twice as many customers despite having half as many employees. Each location will experience nearly double the daily foot traffic of your average Starbucks. Not only that, but every one of these approximately 116,000 stores will be a pop-up, remaining open for just one day and closing for good at night. Oh, and by the way, the more than 900,000 workers will be woefully underpaid. That's Election Day in America. Pretty scary, right? And David Litt wrote the book before the pandemic. The presence of the pandemic has only compounded our problems. And so with 1 week to go before it all wraps up, there is still a lot to occur that we could never imagine. It has been such a whirlwind since Joe Biden was able to nail down the Democratic nomination. We had the death of George Floyd and the corresponding civil unrest in various American cities, the absence of traditional party conventions, the politicization of the pandemic response. You had Jeffrey Goldberg's piece in The Atlantic saying that the president had disparaged the veteran community and the war dead. You had the Bob Woodward emergence of a recording in which the president downplays and admits to downplaying the risk of COVID. The sudden death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, leading to the 11th hour elevation of Amy Coney Barrett, which will be concluded this evening. A report from the New York Times that the self-described billionaire didn't pay federal income taxes for more than a decade, and that he personally guaranteed $400 million in loans that'll come due during his second term, if he has one. You had the president diagnosed with COVID-19, a canceled debate resulting in competing town halls, then A New York Post story comes along about the former vice president's son that leads the New York Post, Fox News, Daily Mail, and AM talk radio, but is largely ignored by the dominant media except for discussions about the future of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. It is a daily fire hose of information. And who could have imagined that Borat would allegedly catch Rudy Giuliani in a honey trap at the end? Or that within an hour of President Obama's return to the campaign trail, the intel community would warn us that Russia and Iran are engaged in election interference. I like to say that if presidential politics were a sport, it'd be a football because you just don't know which way things are about to bounce. But here's an interesting snapshot. Despite all the tumult, the race has proven to be remarkably stable. On November 3rd, 2019, 1 year before the conclusion of the 2020 election, Real Clear Politics average had the race as you are seeing on the screen. It was Biden 51.3, Trump 42.4, meaning Biden was up 8.9%. As of yesterday, despite all that has occurred, the Real Clear Politics national average, Biden 50.8, Trump 42.7, Biden up 8.1. There has been a 0.8 shift in the national numbers pertaining to these two individuals in the last year. Intangibles are always a part of a presidential election. Think about it. Who could have predicted that in 1960, Richard Nixon's debate performance would be remembered more for his lack of makeup than his words? That in 1967, George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, would see his candidacy implode after he said he was brainwashed while in Vietnam? That Ed Muskie would either cry or get snow in his eye in New Hampshire in 1972? That in 76, Gerald Ford, debating Jimmy Carter, would say there is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe? That in 1987, when Gary Hart told the media that if they followed him, they'd be bored, they would, and they weren't. That in 1992, Ross Perot would drop out of the race after saying that the Bush campaign was plotting to disrupt his daughter's wedding. That the 2000 election between Al Gore and George W. Bush would come down to something called hanging chads. That in 2004, Howard Dean's third place finish in the Iowa caucus would be overmatched by the scream with which he ended his concession speech. That in 2015, Rick Perry would say, if elected, he would eliminate 3 government agencies and then not be able to name one of them. Or that in 2016, this amazing trifecta would play out over one weekend. Friday, October 7th, that afternoon at 3:30, the intel community told the media that Russia was meddling in our election. That stunning revelation would soon be a footnote, because a half hour later, 4:03 p.m. on that day, the Washington Post revealed that in 2005, Donald Trump had made crude comments about women while being interviewed by Billy Bush for Access Hollywood. People like me thought that was the end of his campaign. Except almost immediately after the Access Hollywood tape was published, WikiLeaks released a trove of 2,050 emails from the Clinton campaign. Just after midnight, Trump hastily released a video apologizing for his past behavior, calling it locker room talk. The following day was Saturday, October 8th. Donald Trump gathered his campaign leadership at Trump Tower. Speaker Paul Ryan had just disinvited him from a scheduled campaign event that day in Wisconsin. Another Badger State resident, Reince Priebus, then the head of the RNC, told candidate Trump, either you drop out or you lose in a landslide. There were calls mounting for Mike Pence to replace Donald Trump on that day. All of that, by the way, causing Trump to quip, what's the good news? Then comes the following day, Sunday, October 9, the second debate between Trump and Clinton. It was at Washington University in St. Louis. I remember I was there that night. A buzz went through the CNN set while I was on television. We didn't know what was going off, but Trump had pulled off a surprise. Less than 2 hours before the debate, he held an impromptu press conference presenting 3 women who each accused Bill Clinton of sexual harassment, and one who said her rapist had been represented by Hillary Clinton. When the Trump campaign then attempted to have those women sit in the family section of that night's debate, The Commission on Presidential Debate said it wouldn't happen. You couldn't make it up. It's all a reminder of the twists and turns that determine the outcome of presidential elections, the sort of things we could never foresee. Which brings me to this, ladies and gentlemen. Here is the one certainty, the one guarantee, the only thing we know for sure about the outcome of the 2020 election, that we really don't know what's about to happen. Unless you're this guy. Thank you very much. The secret word is now clock. Clock is the secret word. First we had goat, now we have clock. So there you go. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Michael. I think this is excellent. I know there's a number of follow-up questions, and I think, can you hear me, Michael? I think I'm going to be brought back.
Yes, I can. I hear you.
Soon enough. There we go.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, all good.
So there's a lot of good questions that have come in, and there will be some more. I would say, again, first and foremost, thank you, and we're really proud to see this level of analysis. One question I think was answered. Some people were wondering if there was going to be a video of this. I'm told by a colleague we will be posting that on one of our websites if people want to look back to it. So there's I could clump some of the big questions and try to cohere them together for ease of your addressing. Some of them have to do with polls and what's right and what's wrong with polls and what's happened 4 years ago and some of the skew that you alluded to. Number two goes to the kind of election processes, and you mentioned mail-in, and I want to get into that with some of you, something we talked about off air about when we'll know the results of the election. Third is another thing we've been on panels in the past about President Trump, kind of when he might leave the White House, and issues about him pardoning himself or kind of those things. And then hopefully we have time for your analysis on kind of what the future holds for either a more moderate vision of politics than we're seeing, and or some kind of difference between what we're seeing from the Republican and Democratic Party in a world where Biden would win, and then maybe even some third party questions. So there's a lot we could cover, but go back to lots of questions about the polls, the extent to which, and you addressed some of this, but, do you think how it's kind of well, here's a specific one, is specifically with respect to Donald Trump, who, is clearly, is there kind of a Trump skew in the polls? Because people don't want to admit through to telephone pollsters to in-person that they're supporting Trump, given, some of his attributes or what he said, but then they go in the closed door or behind their closed mail-in ballot and they actually vote for Trump. Is that a Trump unique effect, Michael, or is that just ordinary polling error?
It's interesting. Some refer to that as the Bradley effect. And I was actually in California. I have to stop and think about what the year was. It was in the 80s, on the night that George Deukmejian beat Tom Bradley for the California gubernatorial race. And the speculation was that there were voters who didn't want to admit that they were voting for Deukmejian, and it became known as the Bradley factor, or others have similarly named it. We had it in Philadelphia in so far as when Frank Rizzo ran twice against Wilson Goode, you could always add a few percentage points because the perception was that there were progressives, liberals then, who wouldn't admit that they were going to vote for Rizzo. It may be at play here, but I don't think that's why the state polls got it wrong last time. My short answer would be that they had a bad mix in terms of who they expected to show up and vote. It truly is a garbage in, garbage out kind of thing. Unless you properly anticipate what the electorate will look like, your views or your result will be skewed. And they just did not anticipate the rural rebellion that was coming. I don't know that it's so much that they had high school educated white men who wouldn't share it, as much as that group, that demographic, weren't sampled adequately. That would be one explanation. And my second explanation would be that there's just a hell of a lot more national polling than there is state polling. And every time we hear about the evisceration of a newsroom, that there's another local newspaper or regional newspaper that has lost its funding and had to cut people, one of the results of those cutbacks, that hollowing out of local news, is that they don't have money to spend on polling. So in some of the states that people were most interested in, you would have had only 2 or 3 pollsters, and some of them just not so good at what they did. They claim that they have improved their methodology. There are more polls in the field in the battleground states in this cycle than there were last time. I like doing the comparison of, okay, this is where Biden is today. Where was Hillary Clinton 4 years ago right now? And I've done some of this on CNN. And some of the margins are virtually the same. Pennsylvania is one of them, whether it's a 7 or 8 point race at this stage. In other instances, Biden's margin exceeds that of Hillary Clinton. But here's the big caveat, and this is why at the end I talk about the intangibles. If we go back to 4 years ago, still to come was the Anthony Weiner laptop. We'd already had Jim Comey stand up, I guess it would have been in midsummer, and excoriate Secretary Clinton, but not indict her. And then you'll remember in the 11th hour, for about a 72-hour time period, all of a sudden he announced that there was a new investigation because Weiner's laptop had been found. And many people in the Clinton camp think that because of the thin margin in those 3 states, that's when it was lost. The question is, if something should happen within the next 8 days, how much media coverage will it get? I mean, I'm fascinated by the way in which Twitter and Facebook, as well as the dominant media, have handled the very latest story about Hunter Biden and whether it's legitimate news or not. I offer that only to suggest that I'm not convinced something like what happened in four years ago would pierce the media coverage the way that it did then.
Could you follow up on that? Because a couple others have asked about that. As a member of the media, you've worked in different organizations. Even currently, you have 2 different organizations and platforms. How much of a problem or a contributor to the polarization is the media, if you're comfortable offering some thoughts, and the fact that people seem to segment themselves up in terms of what media we consume, does that contribute to the polarization that you described in your talk?
It's at the top of the list. It is the number one item, which may sound strange for someone who earns his keep behind a microphone 6 days a week. But when I talk about how we came to the position that we find ourselves now, I talk about a lot of factors. You heard me reference self-sorting. You heard me reference gerrymandering. Dark money, I think, is a huge contributing factor because we don't know who stands behind those ads. I happen to think that technology has played a significant role. And what I would say, Dean Ruger, is that the television exposure has changed things for me personally, in that now I do a lot of public speaking across the country, and people will approach me because they've seen me on CNN and they'll want to talk politics. Knock on wood, I've never had an uncivil experience. People disagree with me, but the incivility that's part and parcel of our process has never been on my doorstep, so to speak. Now compare that to my social media platforms where people are vicious, and it's like they grow beer muscles when anonymity allows them to say whatever they want to say. I think that is having an impact. So there are many, many things going on, but at the top of my list, I draw a causal connection between what happened in the late 80s, early 90s, for which I've had a front row seat, where the media had been just a handful of sources, and now it became a whole host of sources, and their meal ticket, mouse clicks, eyeballs, ears, was polarization. Not to grow an enormous audience, but to grow a very loyal audience. And it's become a money-making operation. I mean, the gangbuster years for talk radio were the Clinton years, because there was just so much that they could complain about. The Obama years were a bit of a resurgence for the conservative media. And I don't want to get into whataboutism, but I see shades of this on both sides. And the problem is that too many people are hunkered down in their individual silos, subsisting on a diet of AM talk radio, Fox, Breitbart, to a lesser extent now, Drudge, or Slate, Salon, MSNBC. And my prescription is change the channel. Whatever the channel is, mix it up and sample all of the the news opportunities that are in front of you.
Mm-hmm. Well, can you expand on that maybe a little bit autobiographically? Because I know you're somebody who, from your days here at Penn Law through the ensuing decades, and I say this as the greatest possible compliment, that some of your views changed, through some of the inputs you took. And we don't see that often enough. I think we all, and those of us in the academy as much as anybody, we tend to look in our bubbles. But what was it through the course of your career that led some of your views to change somewhat from when you came out of law school?
Listen, when I was a law student at Penn, when I ran for office while a law student at Penn, there's no doubt that I was a dyed-in-the-wool Republican, raised in a Republican household, voted only for Republican presidential candidates, plenty of other Democrats along the way, but at the top of the ticket in presidential years, only for Republican presidential candidates from 1980 when I registered through up until the 2008 election of Barack Obama. And we could have an interesting conversation as to whether I changed more. I definitely acknowledge a shift in my own worldview, or the Republican Party changed more, because as I explain in my remarks, the GOP underwent a seismic shift, so much so that, all those forces of moderation are completely gone. And yes, I lived in this ecosystem. I'd like to think, and I've got a lot of tape to back up, that I was never a part of the extreme elements that I'm condemning today, but I was certainly wrapped up in that environment. And by 2008, I broke ranks and voted for Senator Barack Obama, largely because of foreign policy considerations. I had grown disenchanted with the W administration, believing they'd given up the hunt for bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri. And I had conversations with Senator Obama, multiple conversations about what he would do. And, very famously in an interview, he told me that even if he found bin Laden in Pakistan, he would disregard their sovereign status and go get him. He was condemned by Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, George W. Bush, and John McCain for saying that. And then we all know how Abbottabad turned out. Mm-hmm. So I stayed in the GOP until 2010, and then became the Pennsylvania equivalent of an independent. So I was in the Republican Party all through that time period, and now very comfortable with the status that I have in terms of nonpartisan affiliation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let's come back to this election, and you alluded to the unprecedented amount of mail-in or absentee or early voting. In the chat while you were talking, a lot of people were weighing in with details about different states' regimes, which I should note, as someone who studies the Constitution, that's quite unusual that we delegate choosing our national leader to different states' procedures, okay? But that's certainly part of our history. But one thing with Pennsylvania that I've heard you speak about on the air, Michael, is that they're not allowed to start counting the prodigious 1.5 million, I think, already, mail-in or absentee ballots until the morning of election day. Bucks County, the election commissioner I saw gave a very optimistic press conference, says we'll probably be able to release the results by Friday night after the election, and that's if things go smoothly. So what can you say about when will we know how Pennsylvania voted and other key states, and might we be, and the media be waiting for 4 days or a week or more to even know what the vote tallies say?
I never thought in my lifetime that I would be able to vote absentee without cause. I also don't expect that we'll have open primaries in Pennsylvania, but I hope I'm wrong about that too. And so I think it's a great thing that without regard for this election, I think it's a wonderful thing that finally Pennsylvania is allowing us to vote absentee without cause, and people have really taken to it, perhaps because of the pandemic. But I'm still worried about the ability for us to process all of those ballots, especially, as you point out, because they can't start that process until election day. Something else that I'm a little unsettled about, I'm a believer in making it easy for people to vote, upholding safeguards of protecting ballot security, but I'm a big believer in efforts to get everybody into the process, because I think we dilute the fringes when we have more of a cross-section of Americans participating. So I like that we've gone this route. I'm a little unsettled by the result of Friday's decision by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which is that your ballot can't be tossed for signature comparison when you mail it in. But when you go in, nevertheless, I mean, I think we all know the process in Pennsylvania that you go in and you sign on a binder, hopefully matching the way in which you registered to vote, or maybe now they'll transition to driver's licenses. So you'll still have that experience when you go in to vote, but you won't have that threat hanging over you when you drop it off or mail it in. It's an example of the kind of bug that I think we still have to resolve. And it's like the quote that I read about how we essentially are creating a pop-up Starbucks all across the country with rookies. And then, when stuff happens because of human factors, not because of fraud, but when stuff happens that it gets manipulated and blown out of proportion, there will be things that are going to go wrong. There's no doubt about it. Only if it's a close election is any of this going to matter.
Yeah.
If you see some of these states that I referenced, like Georgia, like an Iowa, some of these states that the president needs in his win column are going early to Joe Biden, then Pennsylvania might not have its vote yet, but frankly, it might not matter.
Yeah. Well, what about, and here's a follow-up question in the chat, is how will the media handle it? So let's say it does come down to Pennsylvania, and let's say there's 1 million votes uncounted, and even there might be, because we know that there's a blue tilt to the mail-in votes.
Right.
What will the media do, and will the precincts report this, if it looks like President Trump has a slight lead in the in-person votes, but we can predict, all the models would say it's going to tilt for Biden? Will they announce election night that of the votes counted, Trump is winning? And then we'll wait. I mean, because we could all imagine kind of conspiracy theorists or the president himself using that. Or do you think your colleague John King at CNN will they how will they deal with that mismatch in timing?
So I don't know to a certainty yet. I know that through my program, I've gone out of my way to try and educate people that we might not know on the night of November 3rd, and that's just fine if we don't. It's not indicative of fraud. My expectation is that CNN, and I think most of the other outlets, will bend over backwards to let people know that the race is not yet concluded, and we just don't know. Of course, the media today is whatever you want it to be. So what other internet sites might do and how some with partisan interests might try and spin this, that remains to be seen. But I feel pretty confident that CNN will really go to great lengths to let people know exactly what the situation is and how it is not yet concluded. Yeah.
I mean, you may be constrained from saying this, but my own feeling is that Fox News will be very important through this week, because, as a kind of, there's going to be fringe outlets, that say whatever they say, but I think I'll be watching them closely, I think, especially if it looks to be a Biden win.
Yeah, I'm actually optimistic that Fox would not jump the gun either. I think to do so, I have to believe that they recognize that to do so, and then 2 days later to have to walk it back at a time where maybe they would have created an issue of stability in the country. I don't think they'll do it. Yeah. I hope that I'm right in that.
So are you willing to, a lot of folks have been asking in the chat, you willing to give us a prediction of the ultimate winner?
I believe that if the election were held today, that Joe Biden would win both the popular vote and the electoral college. You might want to take that with a grain of salt, because I feel like I was so well positioned, given how I think Donald Trump was able to pull this off 4 years ago. I'm a bit embarrassed that I didn't see it coming and give him more of a chance, and I didn't. On many, many instances, I ruled him out last time. So I'm trying not to make the same mistake twice, but you'd surely rather be Joe Biden today than be Donald Trump. And I just don't see opportunity for him unless one of these intangibles that we couldn't anticipate occurs in the next few days. I can't see something that is going to allow him to spin it as far as he needs. But I go back to that Nate Silver information. If an 8-point lead in the Real Clear Politics average gets down to 5 points, we've got a barn burner.
Are you willing to talk a bit about the other races, both the sort of control of the Senate, some of the down market races. Do you see any trends there that could be important? Actually, in the PA State House, I see that, the people are suggesting that the Democrats are doing well in the PA Senate races.
I'm most interested in seeing what happens in the United States Senate. And I wonder if the perception that Joe Biden is comfortably ahead will be to the benefit, this may sound odd, of some of the Republican Senate candidates in close races. Because perhaps a mindset among some voters will be that they've had enough of Donald Trump. They want Trump out. You look at the internals on these polls and you find that it really is a referendum on Trump. It's not a choice election. Trump tried in the last debate, and I thought he was pretty effective, but he's tried to make this a choice between he and Joe Biden. But from start to finish, it's really been all about him, and he's his own worst enemy. He's losing that battle. If the race a couple of days from now, let's say at the end of the week, looks the way that it looks today with Joe Biden in a commanding position, that may benefit Republican Senate candidates insofar as people might want to have a natural check on the system. I mean, Pennsylvanians are famous for splitting tickets between a gubernatorial race and a Senate race. And I think it's deliberate, maybe not, but I could see a mindset among some voters saying, I want Trump out, but I don't know that I want to give a blank check to Democrats who will control the House for sure, to give them the House, the Senate, and the White House. So there could be some ticket splitting of people who vote for Joe Biden, but a Republican Senate candidate. Yeah.
And I should note, of course, the Republicans will have the Supreme Court pretty handily tied up. I see some questions about that, I would say, and I ask you if you have thoughts, Michael, but we are doing another webinar Wednesday, and it's because we can get this, any participants who want information, email the alumni folks you've been in connection with, and we'll make sure you have the link. It's with 3 people who are teaching or affiliated with the law school. Paul Clement, who is a major lawyer in some Republican administrations. Ilana Eisenstein, who's our alum, who's also worked in the Solicitor General's office, now is practicing up in Philadelphia, and Michael Gerhardt, who's a professor at William and Mary, at North Carolina Law School, but really the expert on confirmation politics and impeachment. And so, and Professor Christopher Yu will moderate it. So that's Wednesday at either 4 or 4:30. We can get the link out. Do you have thoughts, Michael, on the Supreme Court process and whether there will be court packing if Biden wins, or should be court packing if Biden wins?
I don't think it's something that he's naturally inclined to do. I think he's going to face a great deal of pressure to go in that direction if he's successful in the election. I understand it was perfectly legal and following of the Constitution what was done with regard to Merrick Garland, but it never sat right with me. The idea that there were still so many months on the clock before the election, I thought it was completely arbitrary. I didn't buy into Mitch McConnell's explanation of this being appropriate when you have different control of the White House versus the Senate. And so while I regard Judge Amy Coney Barrett as being brilliant and qualified, I'm uncomfortable with the idea that a pick that by rights should have gone to President Obama instead has gone to President Trump. This issue is one that Democrats have just not done a good job in explaining its significance. It's a huge rallying point for Republicans. I had a never-Trumper named Peter Wenner, who served in the W. Bush administration, say to me on my radio program that evangelicals stand with Donald Trump because he will bring a gun to a cultural knife fight. And the timing of this, that it should happen tonight, literally 1 week from the conclusion, it couldn't come at a better time for Trump. I think it's a great illustration of why an individual whose personal coda is probably at odds with that of so many evangelicals will nevertheless get their support. And I'm sure he's hoping that this too will provide him with a little bit of a momentum boost, which he needs. So I don't like the way that it was done. That is not a statement about soon-to-be Justice Amy Coney Barrett. And I think that it's pretty damn big for Trump to have 3 within 4 years.
Yeah, I agree. I don't like the way it's done, although I would put more of the strategic vision and thus, I guess, the blame historically on Mitch McConnell. I think he's really this is this is bigger than Trump in that sense. I think it's McConnell and
True.
his willingness to do what it takes, which is why I should say I don't. One reason I don't necessarily favor adding justices to the court is kind of like, I think you all on the call know that that what changed nomination politics was actually Harry Reid. You know this, Michael, kind of changing the way judges were voted on. The so-called nuclear option was started by the Democrats, but then just so expanded by McConnell and the Republicans. And I would worry about that the next time the Republicans take the Senate and the presidency and the House, that whatever justices are added this next year, if it happens, that there's no guarantee that it wouldn't that it stops there and that more people are.
Well, may I just make one quick observation?
Yeah.
What pains me about this discussion is that, take it from someone who answers the phone for a living, because I sit in this studio for 15 hours a week hearing voices from all across the country. And this type of a partisan process, this type of a partisan nomination process, it causes folks across the country to look at judges and justices as being no different from the elected officials who put them there. And they regard them not as jurists, but as Republicans or Democrats under a robe. And that's a shame.
Yeah, and I share that as well. Just to come back to, as somebody who spent a lot of time both in and thinking about the Republican Party, and you alluded to never Trumpers a moment ago, a few questions, and I feel like there's maybe an inherent presumption in a world where we can't predict, but have asked about what if Trump loses. What kind of debate and discussion about the future of the Republican Party is happening, and is there any change in trajectory, or frankly any other kind of change that you would see, a third party or other things like that?
People may disagree with this, but Donald Trump to me is the symbol of a problem. He's not necessarily, the problem is not just Trump. How's that? And I would say in defense of that statement that we're not alone in this country in terms of looking at a wave of populism. Brexit was really the forerunner of what unfolded in the 2016 campaign, and the grievances of people who voted for Donald Trump 4 years ago and will do so again in this election are not going away simply because he's now playing golf at Mar-a-Lago. So we have unresolved issues in this country. I think that the Republican Party, I believe that some of the never Trumper influences are going to try and make a move and reassert themselves, but they'll need to somehow deal with the passion and interests of the people who are at those rallies, 3 of them in Pennsylvania today, and came out and still feel like they are the I'll put it in gender terms, that they are the forgotten man. What happens to them and who makes a play that will be successful in attracting them? I don't know. That's going to take a while. And I'm sure that there will be a Tom Cotton type, or maybe even a Don Jr., who wants to assert him or herself as the standard bearer for Trump politics. And frankly, he's not going away until he really, is gone in one form or another. The idea that he'll go silently into that night, I don't buy. He's going to want to play a role in our process, maybe through a media interest, if this thing doesn't go his way.
Yeah. On more immediately, actually, whichever way the election goes, if Trump loses the popular vote but wins the Electoral College, or if Biden wins both, do you worry about violence, kind of armed reactions, protests? How worried are you about that, given all that you've been saying?
I'm worried in a close race. I'm worried in a close race. If Biden should win in a landslide, I'm less concerned. I don't have any expertise to really offer a good view of this, but my gut, I'm not concerned as long as it's clear that the nation has spoken and this is the outcome. My nightmare scenario is a scenario where we go to bed with a lack of resolution, and that it goes on for days, and now you've got different recounts, or not even recounts, still final counts taking place and litigation. It could be a blank show. I worry about that. Root for a landslide for whomever you favor in this election. If you're for Donald Trump, great. Hope that he wins it in a blowout, and vice versa for Joe Biden. That would be in the country's best interest.
Yeah. Well, that's a good note to end on, although I will also say in the chat, on a more frivolous note, we had a good discussion about in between the Cracker Barrel and the Whole Foods. Do you agree that Wawa is a bipartisan choice, at least around here?
I would hope so. I would hope
Yeah.
we could all agree on a couple of things, and one would be Wawa. Yes.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you so much, Michael, and to all the participants and the staff who helped put this together. And as I said, I think, so Kim did circulate. There's another one coming up on Wednesday about the Supreme Court. But Michael, we'll be watching you and listening to you. I think I speak for all of us on the call in saying that we haven't heard this good an explanation of this really contentious political scene in a long time. And you've really helped me understand this and what to look for on election night. And thank you so much.
Thank you. A privilege for me. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you all for coming.